What's up guys, Trip here once again. Today I'm doing a quick video on immersion. Lately I've been thinking a lot about how stories work and why we care about them so much. And I think immersion is a really big part of it that doesn't get talked about enough. So if you want to learn more about that, please stick around for the rest of the video, and without further ado, let's get into it. So the reason I started thinking about this is I was listening to an interview the other day with I didn't even listen to the whole thing, but it's close to the beginning of George R. R. Martin and Stephen King. They were talking during, I think, a convention or something, and I'll play the clip now.
So one night when I'm awake, I'm saying to myself, well, I'll try one of these fucking George Martin books and see if this thing is any good. And it just carried me away. It just carried me away. The books, which are what books are supposed to do.
You know, as a writer, that's kind of like the ultimate praise you can get, is that the book just took someone away into this world. And that's something I instinctually kind of have felt and knew intuitively, but I wasn't for sure why. And I wanted to think about why I had that instinct, that kind of intuition, and see if it was true or not. And I'm hypothesizing right now it is pretty true that that ability to carry the audience away, to immerse them in your story so fully and vibrantly, is it's one of the coolest things that we can do as authors, and it's one of the hallmarks of a great story. People are going to struggle to remember a story that doesn't, that they don't feel like they're there in the story. Oftentimes those are our favorite stories, the ones that grip us the most tightly and really make us think about our life. And so it's like, what are those authors that are succeeding so strongly? What are they doing that is making their books work in a way that maybe our amateur books aren't working quite so effectively? And what can we learn from those great authors, and how can we put that into our own stories? And so I've got four tips for you all today that will kind of contribute to this. Make sure you stick around to the end, because the last tip I think is the most important. And one thing to keep in mind, just as a little preamble to all of this, is that as much as I'm distinguishing four separate tips here, they all are kind of interrelated, and improving any one is going to affect the others. And so this isn't this is not the sort of thing that you can just, I'm going to sit down today and work on this thing and I'm going to be better at it by the end of the day and it's going to be great. It's not that simple, of course. This is going to be a skill that we work on over the course of years. All of these skills we're working on at all times. Just, they're important things to keep in mind and to make sure, it can almost be like a checklist. Like, does my story follow these rules? Do I nail these boxes and do these things that I need to do to make my story immersive? Let's go ahead and start with the first point, and that's going to be the willing suspension of disbelief. This is essentially the concept of the audience is buying into the story and, kind of trusting us as the storyteller. They're accepting the premises we set as the standard. So the term was originally coined in 1817 by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it basically just suggests that we are kind of, as an audience, buying into the premise the storyteller proposes. So if we take an example like Jurassic Park, obviously we know dinosaurs can't be brought back to life in our normal day-to-day life, but the premise of the whole movie is that there's going to be dinosaurs. It's a dinosaur theme park. And so we buy it, we accept that there are going to be dinosaurs, that we suspend our disbelief about the dinosaurs. We accept, okay, dinosaurs, fair game. And that's something that we as the audience, that's a choice we make. But yeah, so the suspension of disbelief is what's going to allow the reader to buy into all of our whimsical elements, especially if we're doing something like fantasy where we're going to have magic and monsters and crazy sword fights. We need the audience to be willing to buy in a little bit. Part of this is going to relate to how we, present our work of art to the audience. Obviously, if you're marketing a movie and it's going to have dinosaurs in it, you put the dinosaurs in it from the beginning. And so there's no surprises. The audience know they're getting into a dinosaur movie. It would be different if the movie were marketed as some sort of archaeological thriller, and then halfway through the dinosaurs showed up and you're like, what the heck is going on? Dinosaurs weren't what I was expecting. This kind of ties back to our old Promise, Progress, Payoff video, which I will link up there if you want to watch it. The more that we set proper promises at the beginning, the more our audience kind of knows what they're getting into. And this ties in with the suspension of disbelief. If we promise the audience from the beginning there's going to be dinosaurs, they're like, okay, dinosaurs, cool, we're ready, let's do the dinosaurs. So then when the dinosaurs happen, at the end of Act 1 or wherever it is, It's like, okay, cool, we're doing it. We got the dinosaurs, and they're actually excited about it. It's not confusion, it's excitement. And so that's, you know. So I want to talk about another kind of key tangent that goes along with this suspension of disbelief. It's almost its own point, but I'm just going to kind of group it in with this, is this concept of authorial trust or authority on the subject. So essentially what we're doing when we are writing for our readers, they're not necessarily going to trust us yet. They don't know what they're getting into. They're like, I might like this, but I don't know if I like this author's style or their what they normally do. And then we compare that to someone like, say, Brandon Sanderson. This dude's been writing for 20 years. He consistently puts out great books that sell well. Like, you know what you're getting when you get a Sanderson novel. And I experienced this myself. Like I just bought The Lost Metal 2 days ago, started reading it, and there's been very little character description of, you know, the main characters within the first chapter or two. And granted, this is the fourth novel in a series. I remember all the characters, but it has been a year or two since I read the books. And so it's like, yet I could still picture the characters so clearly, and I can picture the setting. And I'm noticing he doesn't go, like, this is no spoilers, of course, but he doesn't really go crazy with description. He tells you what things are, but he's not sitting there saying, oh, and the rocks look gray and have moss on the north facing side. But, you know, he says so-and-so ties this thing around a rock. And it's like, it's interesting to me that I can willingly buy in on that, like, so little description. I'm like, you know what, it's Sanderson. I know he's going to do it right. I'll just fill in the blanks, and it works. I really think it comes down to authorial trust. It's, you know, the more a reader trusts, is willing to put themselves in the author's hands and trust in them, trust that they have got a good story coming down the line, the more you're willing to buy in, that you're only going to be able to suspend your disbelief more. And the more you can convince your audience to suspend the disbelief, the more room you have to do something really crazy and surprise them at the end. So the more we can get the readers to trust in us, and, you know, the more we can prove we have some credibility in what we're doing, that's going to further help to get the audience to suspend their disbelief and to let themselves get immersed in the story. They're not going to worry so much about, oh, I don't know if this is going to work out. Like, I'm not sure if I'm going to like this story. The more they're just like, I like this author, let's just go. And they just start reading it. The more we can do that, the better. All right, and this brings me to point number 2, which is going to be internal consistency and internal cohesion. So again, I kind of have 2 points in one, but they're very linked and related, so I figured I would just kind of talk about it as one topic. This is a distinction I don't normally see that many people make between the cohesion and consistency, but it's something I think a lot about, and I think it's worth delving into a little bit. So most people have heard of internal consistency, and we're fairly familiar with this premise that whatever concepts we introduce in our story, they need to maintain consistency throughout. If, you know, at the most basic level, if we meet in a room at the beginning of the book and the room's described as green wallpapers, if they come back to the same room near the end of the book and there's purple wallpapers, there better be an explanation, because if not, it's just not consistent. And I think most people instinctually understand that this is important, but it can sometimes just be looked over. It's often a matter of taking the time to really examine every detail and not be lazy about it. To an extent, while we're writing our first drafts, I think it's pretty acceptable to kind of wave a hand at it. And, you know, because sometimes first drafts, it's just like, I got to get this thing finished. And if the rooms are going to be different colors and different scenes, oh well. Sometimes it's like that. And that's perfectly fine, but you know, make a note or something for yourself next time you come around to fix that, because that's little things like that. They've ruined the audience's immersion. The audience stops trusting us. We lose that authorial trust, and then they're not believing the story. They're not immersed in it anymore. And now the story's not going to be able to do the thing it wants to do. It's not going to be able to convey emotions and change their mind or do anything like that. So getting these little details right, it really signals to the reader that, like, okay, I can trust them. They know what they're doing. If they're getting these little things right, there's a good chance they're going to get the big picture things right. At least for me, if I notice an author, you know, making typos or misspelling words, or they don't understand how something works, like, that just destroys my trust in the author, and it's going to be so hard for me to want to finish reading that book. It can be little things, but, you know, some readers are like that, where the littlest thing, the littlest red flag, they're like, this just isn't going to work. We want to avoid those by making sure we're consistent about naming things, describing things a certain way. This even goes so far as tone. So tone is a really big thing. You know, we look at something like Family Guy, where they're constantly doing these cutaway jokes that are funny, but, you know, they don't relate to the show at all. And if Family Guy wasn't advertised as such a comedic, you know, fun thing, it's like, why are they constantly interrupting the narrative with all this crap? But it's Family Guy, and that's what Family Guy is all about, because Family Guy's tone is like very lighthearted, comedic, like it's almost like junk food of TV, right? But then we look at something like Abercrombie's First Law, right? And that's like super bleak and grim with those occasional moments of, hope and humor. But there's such a jarring difference in tone. If Abercrombie did weird cutaways like Family Guy does, you'd be like, what am I reading? Like you would not like it at all. But and then by the same extension, if Family Guy had these brutal scenes of people fighting each other and slamming their heads into walls and blood everywhere, you'd be like, this is not what I signed up for with Family Guy. And so it's just like we want to make sure the tone is consistent throughout. Like obviously we can have the more lighthearted moments and contrast those with the darker moments. There should be some contrast, but you can't just jarringly go from one extreme to the other nonstop and with no, reason or logic to it. You got to maintain a consistent tone so the audience kind of knows what they're getting into. Essentially, you just need to be able to read back through your drafts, edit them, look for moments where characters or people or anything feels inconsistent. If it feels inconsistent to the audience, like there should be a reason why it's inconsistent, or you should fix it so it's consistent with everything else. Beta readers will help a lot with catching these issues, but we as authors just also need to try our best to catch them with our rereads and our iterative drafts. But all this, that's consistency, right? So now we can talk about cohesion. Maybe I'm biased, maybe this more applies to sci-fi fantasy than it does to most other subjects, but cohesion, I like to think about that as kind of all the rules and premises of your world and how well they kind of jive with each other. Essentially, we don't want rules contradicting each other. So especially a good example would be like magic systems, right? Because if we go too crazy with all the different magic systems, they're gonna like clash, and the rules aren't gonna work together right, and it's gonna be too much. It's gonna be a headache for the reader to keep up with, and so we just want to be careful about making sure our rules are solid, our premises make sense, and that our premises don't clash with each other. There's no contradictions or loopholes or paradoxes. Get rid of those because those just distract the reader from the story, and they're going to be sitting there wondering like, well, if so and so does this and that means that, then wouldn't this mean that? And it's like that's not what we're talking about. I'm trying to tell you a story. And so we got to make sure we've accounted for all those little flaws and inconsistencies. Let's go ahead and jump into point number 3 right here, and this is going to be our prose. And I know that's not what you want to hear, but prose matter. We need to have good writing because good writing plays into authorial trust. If a reader reads our writing and they're like, wow, this just reads beautifully and it's so clear and easy to understand, there's going to be more trust. We are cutting down and reducing these barriers between the audience, understanding this between the audience and, this experience of the story. Because essentially when we're writing these stories, right, we have a conceptual idea of it. It kind of resembles this thing, and we try to translate that idea onto the page, and we, depending on our skills as an author, we do either a pretty good job or a decent job or a great job, and then we're taking that idea, transferring it to a page, and using that page to transfer the idea to someone else, and they're going to obviously put all their own biases and experiences and things and change the idea a little bit, but our skill as an author is basically going to affect how clearly that idea transmits, right? And so having good prose, having the ability to write well is only going to help and further serve our ability to immerse the audience. Some key things to focus on with this subject are going to be our diction, so using strong evocative words whenever we're describing things, using powerful verbs. There's actually a really quick tidbit. There's some data that I can pop up on screen somewhere that basically people feel verbs. When you write a verb like to run, people like kind of imagine themselves running, and like the mirror neurons, I think is how it works. I'm not a neuroscientist, but you get the idea. Your brain basically fires the same neurons as running. It kind of imagines that it's running. So if we say crouch, like you can imagine yourself crouching and you like feel it for a second there. So using strong verbs, it like automatically helps to put the reader and to make them feel what's going on. Great description, strong verbs, and striving for clarity, I think, are some of the biggest things we can do. Clarity is so big. It's one of my go-to, like if something doesn't make sense, like it's probably not clear enough. More clarity is almost always going to be a good thing. The more we're able to give the readers physical, concrete things to, picture and imagine, the better. The importance of good prose cannot be overstated. Make sure you read grammar and understand how grammar works, because a lot of people think they do, but they don't actually know grammar. And that's like the smallest giveaway. Whenever I go to like r/fantasy and look at new people's works, the first thing, if the grammar's not right, how can I assume anything else is going to be right? If you didn't take the baseline time to learn how to write, it's like, why should I invest my time in your story if you haven't even invested the time in your story? So, this is almost like a base level of like, we just got to get this right, just so that the reader knows we know what's up. And that's just how it is. It sucks, but you gotta be at least a pretty decent writer. You could think of selling a book as kind of your ability to be a good writer and your ability to be a good storyteller. And there's also your ability to be a good advertiser, but we'll focus on these two for right now. So storytelling and writing, you're going to need to reach a certain, like those two combined need to be at a certain level, essentially, if you really want to sell books, right? Ideally, we want both to be amazing, but you need to be a really good storyteller if you're not a good writer. You need to be a crazy good writer if you're not a good storyteller. If you want to sell books, you really need to be great at both. But without further ado, let's get into my last point, and this is going to be arguably the most important one, because if you nail this, everything else will just kind of fall into place. And that's going to be having a great conflict and establishing good empathy with the reader. Once again, I kind of almost squeezed 2 points into one, but listen, having that empathy is going to come from a good conflict. Empathy is going to put our reader into the character's shoes and make them feel like they're there and immerse them. But none of that's going to happen if we don't have great internal conflict for the characters to go through. We want relatable characters, right? And the number one thing that human beings can understand, human beings can empathize with, is going to be conflict. Because we all deal with conflict, and it sucks for everybody. But conflict is such a fundamental part of like the universe and storytelling. So finding a great conflict to explore in your story is going to just make everything happen for you. When you have a great conflict, that means you have great characters to act out both sides of that conflict, and those great characters are going to need certain side characters to show up, and they're going to need to be in this certain situation, and things just have a way of falling into place when the core idea is there. It's so easy to build upon it and expand that idea into something great when you have something strong to work with. I especially want you all to think about the difference between like external conflict, internal conflict, and then a philosophical conflict. I really consider the philosophical conflict to be the core idea of this, and I've gotten a lot of these ideas and terminology from Tyler Mowry, who has a screenwriting channel, but he covers a lot of story-related concepts, and he is excellent at articulating these ideas. So if you haven't checked out his channel, I highly recommend y'all look at it, because he is so great at explaining these ideas, and I feel like I'm only paraphrasing them, but hopefully I'm bringing something new as well. But basically, the philosophical conflict often relates to the theme of our story. So let's look at Lord of the Rings, because I've been reading that lately. Lord of the Rings has a pretty simple philosophical conflict at face value. It's good versus evil, but it's actually a little more nuanced than that. It's more like, why fight against oppressive, overwhelming odds? You know, why should the good even try to be good when the evil is all but guaranteed to win? And that suddenly becomes a pretty interesting theme. It's like, when do we give in to despair versus cling to hope? And there's some really powerful things there, and that gave Tolkien so much to build upon. If we want to go another direction, if we take a look at a book I've been working on called The Flame Between Us, one of its main themes, in my opinion, is this idea that we can only really succeed against, you know, our enemies when we work together. Like, we're stronger together, we're stronger united than we are divided, right? And that's not the most original theme ever, but it's still a strong theme that was really fun to explore. And knowing that was one of my key elements, it was like everything kind of branched out from there. And at times, like, the story wrote itself. It was like, okay, I know it's the characters need to work together to succeed, and they don't need to succeed yet because I'm only a third of the way through the book, so let's split them up and see what happens. And it's like, the philosophical conflict generates all the ideas for you. Hopefully that's a little bit of information about why nailing the conflict of your story is so important. That's about all I have for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any feedback, I'd love to hear it in the description, or if you think you have any other important points to help immerse the audience. I'd love to turn this into a discussion and hear your all's opinions on that. If you enjoyed the video, I would really appreciate if you could like or subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. But that's about it. Yeah, I hope you all have a great day, and that's all. Bye.